So hello again, here's a slightly longer video that will have some speeding up elements because this actual painting drawing took probably an hour and a bit. So I've actually condensed it down to half an hour, and obviously if you stay to the end you'll better see the finished drawing. So what I'm using here for my initial sketch is a rotary mechanical pencil, and as you can see I'm holding it right at the end, and that gives me really nice straight lines when I'm sketching, but it actually sort of keeps things quite loose. The rotary pencils are great, they've got a great weight, they're expensive though, but they're very well made, and they have a mechanism inside that every time you touch them on the paper it rotates the lead, so effectively you're working with a sharpened pencil all the time, which is really neat. I would say it's slightly overkill, to be quite honest with you, for most of the stuff that I do, but I tend to work on the principle that I buy a million pencils, or I could buy one really nice one and hopefully look after it and not lose it. But anyway, so yeah, this is Staithes in North Yorkshire. If you hadn't guessed, it's a place that I spent a lot of time as a kid because I grew up nearby, and there was still quite a lot of fishing boats when I was growing up there, well, knocking about there maybe 35 years ago, and it definitely was a tourist destination, but not a particularly popular one. It felt like it was still a bit of a hidden secret place, whereas now the whole of Robin's Bay is Robin's Bay. What we're talking about, Staithes, is pretty much wholly cottages at the bottom, and you know, such is life. But it still kept its fabric, it still kept its vernacular. Yeah, it's a lovely place, and I must try and get back more and spend more time on the northeast coast. So yeah, I'm fast forwarding a little bit of the pencil process because honestly it's not that interesting, and it's not actually that easy to film because it's a bit too subtle. When I'm normally sketching out something like this, I'll try and be pretty true to the photograph, but that said, you know, if I miss a window, if I miss a chimney, who cares? Even if you know that view, I don't think you'll ever be the sort of person who would forgive an artist a pan tile or a door missing or whatever. You're really trying to capture the spirit of it, and with regard to that, I mean, you could probably miss out a whole building. In fact, you could just do the boat and then a silhouette of the buildings behind. I mean, that's the point. There is literally no rules to any of this. And that's actually something I'd like to talk about more in future videos, of actually all the different approaches you can use, how if you're brave enough and bold enough, you can completely find your own approach, you can find your own language, and the more you do art, the more you kind of realise that putting pen to paper is not as frightening an experience as it can first appear, and that the end result is pretty irrelevant really. It's easy actually, it's easier to start with the things in the foreground. You know, people will say when you're sketching, you should start in the middle and work your way out, or start at the edge and work your way in. I think it's probably the more traditional way. But when you're lining in, it's pretty much the same as when you're doing a sketch without pencil. And it's easy to start with the stuff in the foreground, and that is simply because the lines of the house in the foreground, the shape of that house is always going to obscure what's behind it, so you don't want the lines of things behind drawing into the lines in things in front. I'm going to have to do a little demo to talk about this, because I think it's just one of those things that I take for granted because of my industrial design background, and I did a degree in industrial design, so at least every year, and I worked as an industrial designer for several years. So every day I was sketching. So some of the fundamental principles of, you know, starting in the foreground, working to the background, line thicknesses, you know, how colour can bring things forward or push things back. This kind of thing is I'm going to have to explore more in future videos. So I'll be torturing and boring you for ages with all this. But it'd be nice to. One of the nice things about this subject is there's no end to it. And as I'm creating content, it's pretty much something that I enjoy doing in the same way that I enjoy doing the art. So as long as I enjoy it, that's the main thing. So yeah, I've nearly got the boat in here. Just a simple little fishing boat. Sometimes if you're drawing curved lines, the way the human body works, the mechanics of it's easy to turn the page around. So yeah, the primary foreground is sketched in, and I'm going to draw in the background. And one of the things you have to watch out for when you're doing this is smearing your hand over the ink. On most normal paper, this ink will be sort of touch dry in maybe a minute, depending on how hot your house is or the weather and humidity and things. So if you're like me, if you're right-handed, it's easy to work from the upper right-hand side of the screen down to the left, because you're less likely to rub the edge of your hand over the line work. And I've done it a million times where I've smeared the line work. So starting in the upper left and working down to the lower right, or going across in bands. So you start in the top left, work across into the middle, work across in the bottom. If you're doing a complicated drawing, I find one of the easiest things to do is just periodically use the hairdryer, keep the paper slightly warm, and it means that everything evaporates off a lot quicker. Fine liners don't work the same way. Fountain pens tend to be a lot wetter, so if you're working with fine liners, it's definitely less of a problem, particularly if you're using very thin fine liners, which I know a lot of people like to draw with, and I do sometimes. They are good. One of the reasons I use a fountain pen is because it gives you a lot more irregular lines. You can get a little bit more sense of drama, I think, with a fountain pen than you do with a fine liner. But also, for me, I just love them. I don't know why. I've always liked fountain pens. I think there's something to do with the texture of the nib on the paper. If you spin the nib round, it can go scratchy. If you press down, it pushes the tines of the nib apart and it forces more liquid onto the paper. It's a lot more of a vinyl analog process, whereas I find a fine liner, particularly a new fine liner, to be a lot more digital in feel. When you're sketching these kind of buildings, there's obviously characteristics in all vernacular. I love that word. It's such a pompous word as well. You know, some buildings it's all about, you know, the texture of the rocks. Some buildings it could be about the foliage that's around them, really. You know, like a bungalow, it could be more about the trees. But these houses on the northeast coast, literally facing their gables into the prevailing wind, it's more about the roofs, I think. They don't have big windows because despite a lot of them being sort of Georgian, because you don't really want big windows when you've got a howling gale. So they have smallish windows, but they have beautiful big pan tile and grey slate roofs. So the roofs become the heroes in a way. So a lot of my drawings that you'll see if you look on my Instagram account or on my website and things are, they feature the roofs quite heavily. They are quite sort of unique, and I think there's some story about a lot of these orange pan tiles, which are not massively common in Yorkshire, particularly sort of, you know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, is a lot of them were used as ballast on ships that were returning from Holland, and Belgium, where I think a lot of these pan tiles are made. Now that might be complete and utterly nonsense, so feel free to Google it and say in the comments, "You're talking nonsense, Doug." I don't mind. So you can see that this is starting to come together now. I think I've obviously reached a little bit here where I'm drawing in some more. So the line and wash sort of style, or pen and wash, or you could sort of say maybe it's an urban sketching type style. It's not about putting in all the details. And one of the things that another video I'll do at a later date again is about textures, and about how to sketch certain textures and different approaches, just to sort of show you the way that I do it. Now there isn't any right and wrong way of doing it. You can develop your own But it might be useful for you to have some options and some easy little sort of primers, if you will, to get you started with stuff if you've never sketched a stone wall before or something like that. So sometimes there's some fun elements to sketches that I just think give them a bit of humour. A line of washing, it is a very twee little detail, but I mean it's a nice thing to have in a picture, isn't it? I'm using a big mop brush here, and I'm just putting a whole layer of water where the sky is. I'm not masking it off or doing anything at the top neat. I am literally just going blodge, 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 using a smaller mop brush just to get my edges. Now this is on bocking for smooth paper, which I bought loads of ages ago, and I'm trying to use it because I want to move away from smooth paper, because I quite like rougher paper nowadays. But anyway, this is all I've got. So I'm just being quite free and not thinking too much about clouds. I am just splodging it in a bit, using a little bit of mixing a little bit of grey, using a rigger brush there, very fine brush, and that rigger brush goes in, and I'm just dabbing out. I want to be really subtle, so I'm just dabbing out when I get too much grey in there with a tissue. One of the most useful tools you will ever use for watercolour is a tissue. So as you can see, it looks a bit weird because it looks sort of quite spiky. So what I'm doing is I'm adding in the textures and then dabbing out where I need to. Also, this just comes from practice, like playing with a wet in wet technique with the rigger and a small mop brush. I think I need to do some tutorials on this just to show people at least my thoughts. Okay, so that's the sky very vaguely doing. It doesn't need a really heroic sky, this one, because I want the buildings and the boat to be the sort of heroes. So I've just wet all the water, and I'm wetting all the area behind the boat. I'm leaving the boat dry because I'm going to go back and do that later. And then what I'm going to do here is some underpainting on the water, some underpainting on the boat, and the background as well. So you can see here I've added some colour into the background, but it's come up into the sky a little bit. There's a little bit of green in the sky. I'll go back and sort that out, or I might not bother. So I'm putting in pigment quite heavy here, into just dabbing it into right where the wall is, and looking at the reference image and thinking about where there's more shadow, so I'm adding some more blue in, and then where the dark is on the water. So again, I'm just putting a layer of a sort of simple layer really down of underpainting. Now this is still slightly wet, so I'm going in and adding in a little bit more shadow, particularly at the bottom of the wall there, and at the top where there's that lip. So that's dry now, that's been hair dried. So then I'll go back in and do a simple sort of layer across the other elements that I want to sketch. So as you can see, these bright colours are nicely sort of popping together. I want to actually put in some more shadow on the headland that's behind. I think I've kind of probably gone in a bit too heavy with that. And some more shadow in the foreground as well. And again, this is quite dark, some of this. But if you look on the image, it is quite dark. And this is more shadow or reflection into the boat. And I'm dragging the brush there to use a sort of dry brush effect. There's always a bit in the middle of a painting where you don't really feel very sure, and it doesn't really look very good. And I've kind of got used to that with watercolour most of the time. But sometimes, you see I'm putting some grey roofs in here. Sometimes it's very easy to go, oh! Sometimes it's very easy to think that, oh, that's just not worked out. Sometimes it's very easy to think that something hasn't worked out and just think, oh, I'll put it down, I'll walk away from it. But never do. I mean, if you really do, just continue, because sometimes you find it comes back, but also, you know, you're there to learn and you're there to sort of enjoy the process. So carrying on with something, at least it will give you an idea of potentially how you can save something or go backwards. But until you've sort of pushed through the process and got to the other end and seen how it actually comes together in the end, if you know what I mean. I suppose it's a little bit like cooking in the sense that, you know, you can taste all the ingredients independently, but it's only when it's been put in a pan and boiled up for, or roasted for 2 hours, that you know whether it's actually worked, if you know what I mean. And the other thing that I've learned so much about watercolour over the last couple of years is that if you're working on good quality 100% cotton paper, you can lift off so much of the paint. See here, what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm wetting an element that I want to make lighter. I do it a few times. And it doesn't have to be a lot lighter, but can you see the difference there? Exactly the same there. Going in, water, clean water, dabbing it out. And even on some of these roofs where I think it's just too bright, I'm just pulling out some of the paint. So some paints are staining, so this transparent orange type colour that I use, Daniel Smith colour, you can't pull that out at all. Once that's gone down, it will turn to sort of a very pale colour. Whereas other stuff, other paints, once it's you can almost pull it off, even if it's completely dry. You can wet and suck it off with a towel, and it'll always come off. So yeah, the boat is in the foreground, so that's going to want to be nice and punchy in terms of colour. I think those. So what I'm doing is obviously taking that away and giving it a bit of a hair dry. And there's smaller elements to the boat here, so there's going to be the blue net pot lifter type thing, a bit of blue on the washing line, another layer below the top of the boat, below the deck, because obviously you can't sort of see, well, you can see in the reference image that that's effectively in shadow there. Pantile roofs do have undulations, so it's nice sometimes to paint in a little bit of those ridges in the pantiles, because that's the unique character of those roofs. So I'm painting in some shadows on the boat to make the form sort of pop, and then painting in the pantile roofs, the gullies and the ridges in the tiles. Some grey in the boat windows, and then this is some shadows coming on now. I've mixed up a basic sort of grey as a shadow colour. I appreciate that not all shadows are grey. So in areas where the under the red on the boat, I'd probably put some brown and blue in, brown or blue. I mean, brown or blue mixed is grey anyway. I have a felt tip for the fenders, which I guess is cheating, isn't it? I should be using watercolour, but I don't know, they're fabric pens, my partner's fabric pens for her sewing. The colours are just perfect for the fenders. So I'm trying to do a bit of a suggestion here of reflections. I'll be completely honest, the reflections in this one didn't really work out very well. So yeah, I'm thinking a little bit more here about the walls, and trying to pick up a little bit more texture. I'm thinking, you see me thinking. Now I could at this point go in and start to put some shadow in on the buildings and try and differentiate between one side of the building and another side of the building, but I'm not sure whether I am actually going to do that at this point. I just want to try and put a little bit more on the walls. Okay, so So yeah, I think it's going to need it on the buildings because they do look a tiny bit flat. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of grey. And I've also got to think about how I'm going to do the windows on these buildings. So the shadows literally tell the story of the 3D aspect of those buildings. You don't actually always have to put things like shadows in. I mean, sometimes it's nice to have it without them. But I think if you're in the foreground, say if you've got the boat and you've got shadows on that, it makes sense to sort of tell the story throughout the picture because it brings it together. To put on a sort of slightly dilute shadow colour, have another look at it, have a think, and if needs be, go back in and add shadows. So again, I'm doing a tiny bit more texture there. And then it's just really a case now of what do I do with the windows? And do I want to put any of the highlights in on the water or stuff like that? I mean, yeah. So I'm putting a little bit of blue on the boats, on those fenders, and I'm going to do a little bit more colour on the washing line. And it may be that this time I just forget to do anything with the windows on the building. I mean, I've obviously not forgotten with the boat, but a bit more shadow in the boat. Yeah, again, more. There's a rubber band that runs around that boat as a sort of bumper. Putting that in again just to tell the story of the form. So there, as you can see, because I forgot to record that bit, I've actually gone in and put the grey in on the windows. And then I'm going in with my gel pen, my white gel pen. As you see, I use this a lot at the end of the drawings and add a little bit of dots of highlights of colour, highlights on the sort of reflective surfaces like the fenders, and I might even use a little bit on the water to try and sort of pump up the reflections on the water. So that's it, we're not far off there I think. It's quite a gentle coloured one, and there you get a bit of a close-up of the boat. Of some of the textures that I've used in the rocks, the walls and things. How the houses have been done. I've used a slightly thicker line here just below the washing to demarcate that as the edge of the wall, but mostly this is just single line. And there's, oh, I feel a bit seasick watching this. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I know it's been a long one. I will do a paint long one at some point. The problem I've got is I've got two little kids, and getting the time and the quiet in the house is a bit of a challenge. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching the whole of that, and I hope you like the end result. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe.